Welcome to In the Lab, a podcast from Luminate, the leading provider of data and insights for the entertainment industry. I'm Andrew Wallenstein, Chief Media Analyst with Luminate Intelligence.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Luminate in the Lab podcast. I am Rob Steiner, a media analyst for Luminate Intelligence. And today I am joined by Wyatt Marshall, the Senior Director of Music Intelligence at SoundCloud. Wyatt, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me on, Rob. This is a cool opportunity.
Yeah, of course. And we're here today specifically to talk about the SoundCloud Music Intelligence report that you guys dropped fairly recently. It caught my eye, not only because there were some really interesting trends going on here, and it proved particularly, good ground for this type of podcast format, but also I found that it was ultimately very similar and very different to the type of music consumption analysis that Luminate does. So just to start things off, could you tell me a little bit more about the work you do at SoundCloud and what kind of stuff falls under the music intelligence umbrella?
Yeah, happy to. So in my role, I kind of sit at the intersection of data and culture. I used to be a music journalist, so I'm always kind of thinking through those lenses when I'm doing my work here at SoundCloud. But in my role, I get to leverage the SoundCloud data set. It's a sort of unique, very powerful data set with lots of cool things I'm sure we'll be talking about to tell stories about where music is headed. And it's a fun job sometimes because I often feel like I get a look around the corner about what's happening in music. About that SoundCloud data set. SoundCloud is unique because we have direct upload. So anybody can upload to SoundCloud without going through, a distributor or all that sort of extra legwork that it takes to get up a song live and out there in the world. So it creates sort of an experimental environment where people are more willing to experiment, try new things, explore outside their sound, and really find their voice. And we also have a social networking architecture that underpins the entire platform. And we put those two things together, you get some pretty special stuff to study. And I'm constantly looking at how, communities are forming, how are listeners then engaging with those artists that will sort of form the core of that community. How are artists describing their works and then watching how listeners are engaging with that too. So it's anything around sort of the idea of emerging musical trends seen through the lens of data and trying to make a story out of that other people can latch onto and make it have a deeper meaning. That's sort of my domain, and I feel lucky to get to do this every day.
Yeah, so then with that, how did the Music Intelligence Report come about? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is only the second edition of it, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the Music Intelligence Report actually has been in existence for longer than that, but prior to last year, it was actually an internal-only document. And it was something that, we know that new scenes and sounds are born on SoundCloud. I think the one that most rings the bell for most people is SoundCloud rap. It's our eponymous genre. But really, there are so many different communities on the platform that are constantly evolving, pushing music forward in really interesting ways. And we get to watch that in real time. And so having seen that happen on the platform, knowing that these communities and sounds often go on to shape the mainstream, we wanted to sort of provide an internal strategy document that kind of helped us align on sort of, what's coming down the pipeline in terms of new sounds that look poised to have a bigger impact across the industry. And how can we elevate these sounds, artists, communities, bring them to our listeners and sort of showcase where we think music is headed. And last year we decided, hey, we think this could be pretty interesting to other folks too. So we released it publicly for the first time. We're really pleased with the reception that it got. And really it was about bringing our lens of what we see coming in music to the industry. We want to show here's what's happening in our world. Here's where we think music is headed, and also showcasing the value of and power of our data. We have a front row seat to some interesting stuff with some unique data sets and sort of data points that give us granular insights into music culture, and we wanted to share that.
Yeah. So with that, let's go ahead and get into some of the key charts from this report, starting with the one around music discovery and how you found that a greater percentage of listeners on SoundCloud regularly looked for new music at a much higher rate than like the rest of the US. So yeah, can you just kind of break down this chart a little more and get into, why you think this is the case, what factors are sort of like driving this motivation for music discovery on the platform, like just get into the nuts and bolts of it a little more.
Absolutely, yeah. So the chart you're talking about, where we found that listeners on SoundCloud spend about 43% of listening on current music versus around 24% compared to the rest of the industry average. That's something that one, it kind of stands out because there's discrepancy, but it really reflects the nature of who the SoundCloud listener is. What brings you to SoundCloud in the first place is seeking out that new music doesn't exist anywhere else. It's seeking out a mix that your favorite DJ uploaded. And sometimes this music only exists on SoundCloud. And because of that, you're looking for people who want something new, what's coming down the pipeline, they know that new music lives here. And that's because artists are uploading directly before they really have a name for the sound that they're creating, and the community forms here. And once that community forms here, whether it's SoundCloud rap or psytrance, whatever you want to dive into, the community sort of becomes a beacon for listeners. So artists connect, find one another, push each other creatively, draw from sounds among their peer group as they're finding their own voice. That creates sort of like a scene that then draws listeners who know, like, hey, I heard there's a really cool SoundCloud rap scene over at SoundCloud. Maybe if I want to hear the new music coming from that scene, I'll go to SoundCloud. So it's sort of discovery oriented by nature. And it's exciting for us because it's in constant motion. So it's always changing, always pushing new boundaries. And I think that's what we see reflected in the data here.
Yeah, so it's like it's almost become part of the SoundCloud brand to, for these musically inclined people and artists to come to this platform in particular, like for the purpose of congregating with each other and also just discovering new music.
Yeah, I think so. And you might hear, like, you might be getting into something like bass music and you hear, oh, they're cool bass musicians on SoundCloud putting out, genre pushing stuff that really doesn't, have a toehold in the mainstream yet. I'm going to go to SoundCloud to hear the latest. And I think that's what is now core to our identity, is the idea that what's new is on SoundCloud.
Yeah. Yeah. So then, like, based on these findings and just like what you've observed from the community, how do you think, the community on SoundCloud and the culture it's created, like, how does this figure into this larger conversation around super fandom that's been happening in the music industry for the past couple of years, namely with like, the big three labels, Spotify, Live Nation, et cetera, like all trying to find ways to sort of like better monetize the most devoted of artist fan bases or the fans within these artist fan bases. So like, yeah, like what role do you think SoundCloud has to play in that, if any?
Well, I think that, it's an environment where you can have that kind of deeper engagement, at your fingertips. You can message an artist directly, like I mentioned, but also, we can analyze, who's listening to a track early in its release cycle on repeat or something like that, and see like, oh, these are super fans who are engaging with this music early on in its lifespan, and they're coming back more and more to listen to this artist's catalog over time. But we also have, we want to let artists sort of drive their own boat in terms of how to make the most of that fandom. So, you can press vinyl on demand through SoundCloud. You can, directly tip artists on SoundCloud. That's the capability that's on the way. So there's a lot of ways to sort of like elevate that artist fan deeper engagement, and bring it to the fore.
Cool. Yeah. So with that, let's go ahead and get into more of the findings around genres as the next few charts get into. So yeah, looking at the top genres of the U.S. With hip-hop being the top, electronic and pop coming in second and third. Well, first off, I want to back up and just sort of like get into what you were touching on earlier, whereas like just given how fluid genres can be online, what's sort of the process you guys apply when IDing and classifying these genres, especially for scenes that are, just starting to take shape, that the artists themselves may not even know what to classify as? Like, could you kind of get into a little more about that?
Yeah, like there definitely can be a few different like sort of taxonomies in play. We do rely also, on sort of audio characteristic software as well as some of what we were talking earlier to identify a track as whether it's hip hop or electronic, for example. So that's sort of the highest level view that we have of classifying something in a given genre. But in sort of these frontier emerging scenes and communities, you're right. There isn't really a name for it yet. However, there might still be something that says, okay, this is probably within the hip hop family here, or this generally could be considered electronic music without, being too wrong. But when it came to the more granular levels about those emerging communities is where it gets really interesting because, like we were talking about earlier, some of these scenes and sounds don't really have a name yet. So we're often leaning on the hashtags provided by the users themselves to see, what's the common nomenclature being used here, again, how it's being talked about online, and sort of formulating methodologies and frameworks around that kind of structure to describe this music when we're trying to quantify things, I'd say.
Yeah, and then sort of getting into the top genres on the platform, it was cool and encouraging to see hip-hop at the top of the list, frankly, just given that, there's this larger conversation happening in the industry over like hip-hop's decline, and at least in the mainstream sense. It's something that us at Luminate get asked a lot about. So just from your perspective, like, what do you think hip-hop's dominance on SoundCloud says in the context of that larger discussion?
It's something I've been asked about many times too, but I think we have a different take on it. We don't see anything about hip hop really being in decline. We see it sort of, planting seeds everywhere. We were talking about communities just a minute ago, and we see dozens and hundreds of hip hop communities across our ecosystem that are pushing hip hop in interesting ways. And some of those that we saw really take off in the last few years that we were talking about in our report 2 years ago include UK underground rap and artists like SD Kid and Fake Mink who came out of that and are now playing Coachella and headlining Rolling Loud and things like that. Maybe I'm wrong on the headlining part, but we see hip hop evolving in really interesting ways, and it's really sort of it's touched on so many aspects of culture that it's kind of everywhere in some senses. Like we see hip hop being a core element of new emerging kinds of indie music on the platform, where an artist might have a track that sounds more like a hip hop track right alongside something that sounds like a bedroom indie track on their feed on their SoundCloud. So we see hip hop like continue to evolve in really interesting ways, and that's reflected in the fact that it's also our top genre in the U.S.
So it almost kind of sounds like a similar situation to the people who always claim that like rock is dead, where it's not really dead. It's more of just like it's gone underground that more than it has before. Like it's still very much alive in sort of the undercurrents of the genre.
Yeah, and it's evolving too, and we're also in an era of personalization where people can seek out music that really resonates with them deeply. So rather than sort of a monoculture top-down approach to this, we're seeing people finding their communities that they feel a deeper connection to, and rather than sort of something that's necessarily reflected in overall top massive streaming numbers. Perhaps we're seeing hundreds of communities all growing in smaller ways rather than one kind of like dictated monolithic kind of approach to a single artist taking the limelight. So that was a long-winded way to say that we see lots of interesting communities where this is thriving, and like you said with rock, we're finding rock has woven its way into really interesting corners of SoundCloud too. A few years ago, we started to notice that artists like the Deftones were starting to resonate really, in a big way with hip hop artists, and they were sort of tapping into this sort of like dark, heavy energy of nu metal. And something that was interesting in our report was we found that 57% of Deftones listeners on SoundCloud have a most listened genre of hip hop on the platform. So we see crossover on the platform constantly, and sounds kind of like cross borders readily, and we think that's in large part thanks to the nature of our platform, where it's kind of more experimental, thanks to the direct upload, and then sort of the social networking aspect being something where you can pull from your network as you're finding your own voice.
Yeah, no, that is really cool to hear. And yeah, that was definitely one of the things that stuck out to me, like, was this chart on the growth of rock music on the platform, particularly in the latter half of 2025. That 37% jump is substantial. From what it sounds like this growth in rock is being driven primarily by elements of the genre being incorporated into other styles rather than like an explosion of rock bands. Like, is that a fair way to characterize it?
I'd say it's a little bit of both. Like on the chart that we're looking at, like, yes, rock is the third fastest growing genre in the U.S., but I think we're not there yet. But the next chart with the guitars, I think, is that the one you're referring to?
Yeah, that's the one I meant.
Yeah, and there we're kind of looking at a specific scene. So we're looking at like a very specific community of artists on the platform where we see this kind of like evolution in their own sound. So like these artists start off making music that if you put it through like a genre detection system, the percentage of tracks tagged rock by that system have gone up over and over and over, over time, as they're sort of leaning more into rock to develop their own sound. So this is a case where some folks started off making, more hip hop type music, but some, at a certain point along the way are picking up guitars and leaning into that. And, some rising stars we see coming out of this community include like Booney, B-U-N-I-I, who is recently an ascending artist of ours here at SoundCloud, who are really kind of like becoming the face of like a new, I call it like eclectic indie rock that's really native on the platform and sort of like a new generation's version of rock music that might not sound like what we thought of rock 25 years ago.
Yeah, and what struck me from this particular chart with the percentage of eclectic new indie scene tracks, it was interesting seeing folk pointed out as well. I was wondering if you could kind of like get into a little bit of like how folk's influence has been manifesting into the music you guys have seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more kind of like elements of like acoustic leaning indie rock, perhaps like emerging to the forefront here as well. But we're really seeing a new generation of artists and listeners, like you said, embracing some of this early 2000s kind of music that's novel to so many people right now, because they didn't live through it. So whether it's indie a la Strokes, or if it's Ben Queller style, like acoustic pop with like an indie bent, like we're seeing a lot of people really leaning into just kind of like sounds that haven't been as popular in recent years, and it's coming out in interesting ways and reflected in some of the charts that we're seeing here.
That it's a little humbling hearing the Strokes as like a band people didn't live through, but that does make sense.
Yeah, right there with you. Yeah,
that it is interesting to see how that this incorporating of older genres and into modern sounds is driving rock's influence, or driving rock's growth on the platform. If we want to jump back to the previous chart, like that's also very much what's happening with electronic music, it seems, but like to an even larger degree. So can you kind of describe like some of the factors you're seeing behind electronics growth in particular? Is it a similar story to rock, or is there something different happening here?
I think it's slightly different, given that electronic has been such like a foundational aspect of SoundCloud's identity since early on. There are so many different deeply rich electronic scenes on the platform, and recently we have seen an uptick in people kind of like it's become easier and easier for people to sort of lean into the elements of electronic music that it used to be sort of like a better kept secret. We're seeing more and more electronic acts headlining or playing at large music festivals in the United States. So you see it at the macro level, but kind of like we were talking about earlier, SoundCloud is known for being a home for electronic music. So if you want to find the newest, like coolest music coming in your XYZ electronic scene, there's a home for it on SoundCloud. And electronic musicians are really savvy about using the platform. They lean into it in really interesting ways. They use it to host remix competitions, leverage one another's networks to book shows. Like electronic musicians are pros at using SoundCloud. Just yesterday, we had Subtronics providing remix feedback on our Twitch channel, for example. And, we've got so many cool collaborations with electronic artists over the years. And so as electronic is growing with, a broader audience, SoundCloud is kind of like a natural home for many of those seeking to uncover what that's all about. And we're also seeing in this track in this chart in particular, it's not just listening. Electronic has been the fastest growing genre on SoundCloud for the last several years running, but it's also artists creating. So more and more artists are uploading electronic tracks on SoundCloud, and it's at the highest point since I've been here in terms of the percentage of uploads that are electronic music tagged. So artists are tapping into emerging technologies to make electronic music more readily, while they're also, as we know, like we were just talking about, embracing some more analog means at the same time. But it's become easier to become somebody who can experiment with electronic music as DAWs, digital audio workstations, have become more and more powerful. And you're also, the creation is meeting the demand. More and more people are seeking out electronic music, and more people are making electronic music.
It sounds like almost like the work in progress aspect of these songs is a big part of the experience for both artists and users.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can experiment, you can try on new things, you can see what resonates with your audience, and you can throw up what people call like a Lucy on SoundCloud and get people to engage with it just to see feedback on something you're trying out as an artist. So like when artists do that, they're knowingly tapping into an engaged audience to elicit, feedback on something that they're trying that might be new for them, or pushing the boundaries in some way. But yeah, the experimental nature, I think, is a big part of what makes SoundCloud so interesting, because ideas don't need to be fully formed in order to get out there, get some feedback, and really try out new things that might not fall neatly into a polished bucket that that allows for greater creativity to continue to proliferate on the platform.
Yeah, and I imagine that also contributes to just sort of the ever-flowing nature of like the genres and sounds found on SoundCloud. And sort of like with that too, like it is interesting seeing SoundCloud where it's at now, because there is, on top of this ever-changing, nature of the music found on the platform, there is now also like a legacy being formed, namely through like SoundCloud rap. So like with that genre in particular, like just given everything we've talked about, like how do you think SoundCloud rap has evolved, in the time between like its initial mainstream breakthrough to today? Like, is it even still something that can be classified at this point?
There's so many different variations of and subgenres of hip hop that were born out of SoundCloud rap. At the time, it was perceived as something that was new and novel, and people weren't necessarily, it didn't fit neatly into the box of what came before. But I think that's true of so many different sounds that are born on SoundCloud, and they go on to shape the mainstream. So recently, we've seen myriad hip hop scenes and sounds sort of develop on SoundCloud that have, probably trace a lineage back to that era. Things like plug music, rage music, just to name a couple. Jerk hip hop is I use air quotes here because, again, a lot of these things are, they don't necessarily have a full name, but some people might use that terminology to refer to the sound. What's commonly known as UK Underground. All these things, you could trace it back up the tree to, Lil Uzi Vert, Lil B, like so many different artists from that era who are really pushing boundaries in ways that, still resonates. So I think, whatever the label is you're going to stick on it, I think it's definitely still resonating today and continuing to evolve. And, stuff that was on SoundCloud, generating comments from a few hundred listeners 2 years ago is now, playing on the biggest stage at Coachella. Like that's pretty incredible to see somebody like I'm referring to Fake Mink here, somebody who 2 years ago was developing their sound on SoundCloud, pushing boundaries, now showing up on the main stage. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I mean that's super cool. And also on top of that, SoundCloud has been behind some of the biggest artists in recent memory. Which, that I imagine that's cool to see from your vantage point.
Yeah, we get to watch careers evolve from their earliest stages. In some cases, finding their voices and then going all the way up the charts. So it's awesome.
With that, I want to get into the last pair of charts we have here, which you described as the bedrock for the Music Intelligence Report entirely. Just what's going on with these maps? Can you get into them a little bit?
Yeah. In many ways it is, and that's why I refer to it in that way. But what we're looking at here is sort of a network of artists on SoundCloud, and how they sort of self-identify and form communities and scenes on the platform. So each color here is what we're calling a different scene. Some colors get repeated. What you'll see here is pockets of artists who are linked together on this 2D plane through their mutual interaction. So how artists are engaging with one another gives shape to scenes in this map, and then further draws in listeners that are attracted to those scenes and so on. So this map is essentially, we call it our creator network map, but it's kind of think of it as a living document. Like this is a still, but really this is moving in real time as, new sounds and connections are made between artists and fans and artist to artist. And it's sort of a reflection of the various communities on the platform. And, in one corner of the map, you might have, a specific hip hop scene. In another corner of the map, you might have a Vina house or Indonesian breakbeat. This thing really runs the gamut in terms of the different kinds of music being made on the platform. And it's a really useful framework to think about how to, understand some of those emerging communities that live on SoundCloud.
That's fascinating to see this visualized in this way. With this first map, it looks like it's Europe. Is that what's going on here?
There's not a geographic underpinning here. What's really defining the shape of this here is how artists are interacting with one another. How communities are forming on the platform. So yes, it does kind of look like some kind of Pangea with a little Europe on there maybe, but really it's about visualizing the social networking that's occurring on SoundCloud. So how you can think of it as a social network map, basically. So how are artists and fans congregating on the platform, and then leveraging some of the techniques we talked about earlier, thinking about things like hashtags, a lot of research and other aspects. Sometimes there might be a geographic component underpinning this. Maybe a cluster of artists are all from a given place, and that's why they're interacting with one another and forming a community. But through that, creating sort of a map of the world of sound on SoundCloud.
Got it. So this is really just sort of how all the different genres within the platform intertwine with one another.
You could think about it in that way, and the proximity of one grouping to another would indicate some kind of cultural affinity, and it's really kind of a culture map rather than just a musical map, because, people are drawn to, there might be very eclectic scenes, for example, out there in the world. We see more and more, people are more omnivorous in their musical tastes. So really, when people interact and form bonds, it's a reflection of culture as well as music. So that's another thing at play in this big, beautiful map here.
That's really interesting. So then, what's going on between like the two maps you provided here? Like what are the differences between them?
Yeah, so one's kind of a zoom in on the other. So the larger one, we then zoomed in on a section down here, and here you're sort of seeing a corner of some of the very active and growing hip hop scenes on the platform. And each dot, I should have prefaced this, each dot here is an artist. And so you can think about how artists are engaging with one another, and the proximity between the two dots is reflective of that engagement and how the contextual similarity between those two. So this is sort of like a corner of what if you were to visualize the world of some emerging SoundCloud hip hop scenes and think about it as a social graph. That's what we're seeing here.
So then, like, what do the colors represent here? You said that it's based on genre going on.
Well, it's not just genre. Like we're making a distinction here between genre and community. Community might encompass different sounds and so on, but often, a color might be indicative of a genre, so like perhaps you might have a scene on this map that's, UK underground, and near, that eclectic indie we were discussing might be in another corner. So yes, but within those scenes, there can be a greater breadth of genre sometimes, not always. Than a typical genre thumbprint.
So then, like, given that, like, what do you make of these, like, sort of outliers on the charts that are almost sort of like their own islands in a way?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting call out. So, I mean, some scenes are worlds unto themselves, perhaps they're pretty isolated in what they're creating. Other times, you might have a lot of sort of stylistic crossover between one group and another. Like they're distinct cultural groups, perhaps. However, they lean on an affiliated scene. Maybe it's think about DMV rap and Philly rap, for example. Perhaps there's links there, but they're distinct entities. So we're kind of capturing some of that. But in some cases, people are off in their own world, making their own sounds and totally kind of like self-contained units that are fascinating looks on their own, but they don't have a whole lot to do with what's going on around them.
Cool. Yeah. No. These are like fascinating to look at. Especially with, having this context of what's actually like, going on here. But, in terms of like the research that you all do, like, what are some of like the biggest, or I guess most surprising trends that were unveiled by these maps for you?
I think just seeing, understanding where the idea of like fluidity across genres, I think is something that's really fascinating. So, we see it happening on SoundCloud. Sounds evolve in interesting ways here. Like that's why, there have been myriad examples of like a new subgenre or sound emerging on SoundCloud. Being able to visualize that and sort of seeing the like how one group of creators, distinct unto themselves, might be leaning on a nearby group of creators to develop something, that kind of pulls from across genres is incredible. So I've used this example a couple times in this call, but like the UK underground rap scene, for example, was heavily kind of like inspired by, in some ways, like some movements that are happening in the US, but they spun it in their entire own way to create something entirely, unique to what's happening in UK hip hop right now. And it's gone on to have global success. So like kind of similar to how drill went from Chicago to the UK and to then influence New York, we kind of see something similar happening with underground hip hop, where artists in the US are inspiring artists in the UK, and now they're sharing producers, and it's kind of this incredible mix of influence that's all coming together to create movements in music that are really resonating. So I'm always interested where's the boundary being pushed? Where's it going next? Our users continue to excite and surprise.
Wow. So like you can really get a bird's eye view on how these genres are emerging and taking shape in real time.
Yeah, that's the idea, and it's thanks to that architecture of social networking, a two-sided streaming platform with artists and listeners who both come here, to find each other, and through all that, we get to watch musical communities take form in real time, listeners engage with them, and then at a certain point, we kind of get a feeling like, hey, this is something on the rise here. And that's kind of what we're talking about in the Music Intelligence Report. So we talked about, UK underground rap in last year's report, and in the beginning of 2025, and then SD Kid became one of the hottest acts in hip hop over the course of the rest of the year, and that story is still being written about the incredible heights that those artists are reaching, and it's constantly reinventing itself too, which is what's exciting. We see new stories emerging every time we check back in with what's going on.
Yeah, and just sort of like wrapping up here, like kind of talking about like these larger takeaways from the report. How can paying attention to what's happening on SoundCloud, like within these smaller but incredibly active communities, like how do you think that can help the industry predict like what's coming next, like what the next breakthrough artist might be?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a lot of people have been looking to SoundCloud for that kind of signal for some time. I think it's we see new voices, new sounds emerge on the platform, and they push music in interesting ways like we've been talking about, and they attract other artists who want to be a part of this community. You see something interesting happening and you want to try your hand and get feedback from people who you see as inspiring, who might become your peers. Perhaps maybe you're an artist looking for a producer, or a producer looking for a vocalist. You congregate on SoundCloud, and through that we see groups form, and we see listeners attracted to those groups. And then when you start to see growth in those two directions, it's an interesting thing. And so it's our methodology to be cognizant of these things, and we talk about them in our Music Intelligence Report because we want to sort of say, hey, this is a cool thing we see happening. So if you're paying attention to that, it's a good way to see what's coming around the corner.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited to see whatever's coming next, and what sounds are going to emerge from the platform. And I'm sure in a year's time, when the next report comes out, it'll be a whole new set of sounds and artists.
Yeah. Me too. It's always exciting to see where things head. It's one of the joys of the job. But I'll probably be getting to work on that in not too long. So maybe I'll start have a think on what might be coming.
All right. Yeah. Fair enough. Well, Wyatt, thank you again for sharing your insight and breaking down these charts for us. And again, the Music Intelligence Report was really fascinating, and I look forward to whatever comes next from you all.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Robin. Thanks for having me. This has been really cool.